On January 13th, 1982, at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a narrow-body Boeing 737 departed Washington National Airport. There were 74 passengers on board. It was snowing and cold. As the plane began to take off, the pilots noticed ice and snow on the wings. The first officer noted to the captain that there seemed to be a problem with the power from the 2 turbofan engines. There just didn't seem to be as much power as the instruments were indicating. The captain acknowledged but opted not to abort the takeoff. The plane took much longer than normal to get off the ground, and as soon as it did, the stick shaker built into the controls of the airplane began to alarm and alert the crew to an imminent stall. The plane climbed, but almost as soon as it did, it began to fall from the sky. 30 seconds after takeoff, and less than a mile later, the plane struck the 14th Street Bridge and plunged into the icy Potomac River, where it quickly submerged. With Washington, D.C. being the heart and central nervous system of this country, there is a large number of media personnel in and around the district, and they quickly arrived at the crash scene, almost from the time the plane hit the bridge. What follows is the tragic story of a crash that didn't have to happen, pilots who ignored critical steps and regulations that were lax, and a rescue caught on camera almost from the beginning. This is Radar Contact Lost, the podcast. I'm your host, Dave Gorham. I'm a retired aviation meteorologist with a career in the United States Air Force and commercial and broadcast weather forecasting. I've created this podcast series to bring you interesting but tragic stories of airplane crashes from around the United States and from around the world. Today's episode, when Air Florida Flight 90 crashed into the 14th Street Bridge, is about how a Boeing 737 took off from an airport that had reopened just a few hours before, having been closed earlier in the day due to snowfall, where the plane struggled to get off the ground. Ultimately, the plane could not stay aloft and crashed moments after takeoff into the Potomac River. 70 of the 74 passengers on board died. 4 crew members died, including both pilots, and 4 motorists on the bridge died when the plane struck their vehicles. Why couldn't this plane successfully climb away from the runway? What went wrong? Turns out, a lot went wrong. Accidents, no matter the type, rely on not just one incident, but a series of incidents, or what some might call coincidences. Yesterday, and this is true, I didn't just drop a bottle of relish on the floor, sending glass and diced pickles everywhere. No, I was trying to grab too many items. I already had the mustard and mayo in my hand, and I was holding the door of the fridge open with my shoulder. As I leaned in to reach for the relish, the mayo bottle bumped a bottle of juice, causing the relish bottle to slip from my hand and crash to the floor. Fortunately, the loss of the relish wasn't a big deal, but it's easy to see that the relish didn't just fall to the floor. In my own post-breakage investigation, I discovered that I made a series of errors, any one of which, if not made, would have prevented a broken bottle on the floor. Any disaster has the same lead-up of errors, mistakes, coincidences, some major, some minor. Remove any one of them, and the disaster is averted. A series of errors. This was the case on this day in Washington, D.C. Pick almost any city in the world, and you'll find multiple main thoroughfares designed to bring travelers into the city and then ease their way out of the city. Many of these cities are surrounded by water, lakes, rivers, drainage channels, etc. that require bridges. Add in bridges that cross railroad tracks, other roadways, highways, even pedestrian bridges, and the number of bridges in a given city can be quite high. Yet, very few of these bridges in America can claim to have been burned to the ground by American forces retreating from an invading army. Crossing the Potomac River, the 14th Street Bridge in Washington, D.C. can claim this. During the War of 1812, the Americans destroyed the bridge to halt the advancing British forces. The bridge was rebuilt, but has had a precarious existence. Flooding and ice flows, even barges and other river traffic, have damaged the bridge. Rebuilding, repairs, expansions, and refurbishments all try to stay one step ahead of the increasing need. From its original construction in 1809, the bridge has expanded into a series of bridges. There's the original 14th Street Bridge, today named the Arlen D. Williams Bridge. This bridge, the busiest of all the bridges, includes the northbound or inbound span of Interstate 395 and U.S. Route 1. U.S. Route 1 is also known as 14th Street. Just a few feet away is the southbound span. This is named the George Mason Memorial Bridge. And the bridges carry a combined 300,000 plus vehicles per day. Just downstream from the Arlen D. Williams and the George Mason bridges is the Charles R. Fenwick Bridge, which carries the yellow rail line into and out of D.C. This is the newer of the two rail bridges, although both are sometimes referred to as the Long Bridge. In all, Google Earth shows 5 spans crossing the Potomac, all gathered under the general header of the 14th Street Bridge. It sounds complicated, and like all major cities, it is. But this podcast is about airplane crashes, not bridges, no matter how historic, beautiful, or otherwise noteworthy they may be. Except the Arlen D. Williams Bridge is the site of a tragic airplane crash in 1982, and this is what we're going to talk about today. It was a cold and snowy day in Washington, D.C. A strong January cold front had blown through the day before, and though the front itself was well offshore, a lingering trough of low pressure was allowing the snow to continue.
We've got the strong winds again and some concerns along the coast, so it's multifaceted. But this time, I think in the end, what you're going to remember most, probably going to be the snowfall totals and how hard it's snowing at certain parts of this storm.
This was the same storm that had paralyzed the South the day before. Places like Atlanta had motorists stranded by snow and ice in their cars on the highways. Florida's citrus crop was frozen and ruined. Snow fell as far south as Del Rio, Texas, on the border of Mexico. Now, brisk northeasterly winds brought a brutally cold and moist wind to much of the East Coast. Today, the winter of 1982 is one for the record books. The NMC, the National Meteorological Center in Washington, D.C., issued a weather map just 2 days before the Air Florida crash, proclaiming January 11th as the coldest day of the century. It was minus 27 degrees Fahrenheit in North Dakota and 2 degrees Fahrenheit in Texas. Just 4 days later, on the heels of the same cold front and temperatures that continued to drop, a day now known simply as Cold Sunday occurred on January 17th, when unprecedentedly cold air flowed south from Canada and dropped temperatures across much of the United States far below existing all-time record lows. Today, the airport in this story is known as Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. In 1982, it was known as Washington National Airport, or more simply, National Airport. Today, most people refer to it as Reagan National, or the old-timers still call it National. It was, and still is, the primary airport serving Washington, D.C., but it's the smaller of the two main area airports. The larger airport, Washington Dulles International, lies about 15 miles west of the capital, while Reagan National lies less than 3 miles from the heart of D.C., the Washington Monument. The White House is just a half a mile beyond the monument. The airport is surrounded by the Potomac River on 3 sides, and that includes the river, plus the associated tidal pools and mudflats. The southeast end of runway 33 actually juts out into the river just slightly. The west side of the airport is bounded by U.S. Route 1 as it bends south after crossing the river using the 14th Street Bridge. On this day, with more than 6 inches of snow recorded, the airport had been closed due to the weather earlier in the morning. In fact, even after it was reopened at midday, flying conditions were marginal throughout the afternoon, and it closed again mid-afternoon to then reopen at 2:53, a bit more than an hour before Air Florida Flight 90 was to take off. However, the series of errors that led to this tragedy had already begun. There are multiple ways to keep an airplane free from ice, both proactive and reactive. So let's cover some definitions. Most modern and commercial aircraft have both anti-icing and de-icing equipment installed. Anti-icing prevents buildup of ice on the lifting surfaces, the wings, and also on the tail. This is in the form of applied heating equipment built into the leading edges of the wing and tail. But there are other things that need heat, just like the defroster in your car. Airplane windshields have a similar device installed. The pitot tube is heated. This is the device that measures airspeed, and it needs to stay free of ice. The pitot tube provides critical airspeed information to the pilot and flight computers. Improperly indicated airspeed can lead to significant issues for the pilot. Engines need to stay free of ice as well. Whether an engine uses carburetors or fuel injection, heat is needed to keep the fuel flowing. And this is true every day of the year, not just winter. The temperature drops with altitude, and you might be surprised to know that you don't have to go that far up to experience freezing temperatures, even during the hottest summer months. Aircraft can have even more anti-icing equipment, like an electrically heated windshield, and just like your car, a spray solution can be sprayed onto the windshield to help disperse ice buildup. And let's not forget the propellers. De-icing fluid can be applied to the propellers, and the leading edge of the propeller can have heated elements installed. Again, this is anti-icing equipment that prevents the buildup of ice. It's a proactive way of addressing the problem of ice on the airplane before it becomes a problem. The reactive way of addressing ice on the airplane is to remove it after it forms. This equipment is called de-icing equipment. On the airplane, this comes in two ways. The first are inflatable boots on the leading edge of the wing and tail. The pilot can activate this feature, and as the boot inflates, the ice will crack and break, and then the wind sweeps the ice away. Another de-icing feature is what's known as the weeping wing. De-icing fluid can be pumped through a mesh across the wing to dissolve and disperse the ice buildup, though this same feature can be considered anti-icing if fluid is pumped across the wing and tail to prevent ice buildup before it ever forms. So far, I've only talked about the ways the airplane can rid itself of ice. However, we're probably all familiar with airplanes being de-iced while on the ground at the airport. Let's talk about this, as it is one of the primary contributors to the Air Florida crash. In fact, this was so significant to this incident that the regulations on how a plane is de-iced by the ramp crew were rewritten following this crash. Perhaps you've been in an airplane while it's being de-iced. Forgive the pun, but it's kind of cool. For me, the first time I experienced this was on a return flight to Houston from Chicago. It was January, so it was typically cold, and on this day it was snowing. The weather caused me to be concerned, but I put my faith in the process. A technician in a cherry picker rolled up to the airplane, and using the nozzle controls attached to his platform, he methodically blasted the plane with heated fluid as I watched. Lots of steam, and then the fluid ran down over my window, and I couldn't see much after that. I didn't fully relax, however, knowing that the most critical aspect of the flight, the takeoff, still lay ahead. We taxied out onto the runway and took off shortly after the de-icing, and everything turned out fine. But this is not what happened to Air Florida Flight 90. Oh, they were de-iced, but then they didn't take off. Not right away, anyway. They were de-iced at the gate, and then they waited, and then they waited some more before they finally took off. Following the crash of Flight 90, the process of de-icing an airplane has been changed so that the planes are now de-iced closer to takeoff. We'll talk more about this in a few minutes, but let's return to the airplane, the flight crew, and the ramp personnel. De-icing vehicles, the ones actually spraying the airplane, typically carry two types of fluid, de-icing fluid and anti-icing fluid. Because they're used for different situations and have to be applied in a particular order, they're two different colors to avoid any confusion. The orange de-icing fluid used in step 1 is a heated blend of water and typically propylene glycol, though ethylene or diethylene glycol can also be used. The exact mixing ratio of the fluid is automated, and the equipment on the truck blends the solution according to the outside weather conditions. This process removes snow and ice from the plane. Step 2 is the application of the green anti-icing fluid. This spray prevents buildup of ice on the airplane after de-icing has already removed it. This fluid is similar in composition, but by design, it's not heated and it's a bit thicker so that it tends to stick to the airplane and it helps the plane remain free of ice after it's been de-iced. But this is not an indefinite application. Depending on conditions, airplanes may have to be de-iced and anti-iced more than once between the gate and takeoff. A second de-icing or the time between de-icing applications varies on several things, including the weather. drizzle, rain, snow, fog, mist, and the temperature all become factors in the determination of if or when a second or an additional de-icing application is necessary. Now de-iced, Flight 90, call sign Palm 90 or Palm 90 when on the radios with air traffic control, began the pushback procedure from the gate. The fluid sprayed on for de-icing and anti-icing is slippery, and the traction was so poor that the ground service's tow motor could not get traction. Snow or ice can be an issue here at the gate. Snowplows can't move around the airplane, and salt cannot be used due to its highly corrosive nature. But ramp personnel use scrapers and other tools to keep the gate and ramps free from snow and ice. But still, the de-icing fluid is slippery, and it was snowing. So, the tug can't push the 737 away from the gate. What next? Well, what you should not do is use the reverse thrusters of the plane's engines. In fact, there are rules specifically prohibiting this. But the Air Florida crew, who did not have much experience flying in snowy conditions, engaged the reverse thrusters and attempted to rock the plane backwards. One of the ramp technicians interviewed later said he had to move away from the area because the reverse thrusters were blowing ice and snow all around. But the reverse thrusters didn't work either, so the ramp crew got a heavier tug, one with snow chains, and the plane was then successfully pushed back from the gate. So now Palm 90 taxis to the runway. Because of the airport closures earlier in the day, there are a lot of delays and there are a lot of airplanes waiting to take off. Palm 90 waits its turn and slowly moves towards the runway. But the clock is ticking since the last de-icing at the gate was quite a while ago, and the captain realizes that a little extra heat right about now would be a good idea. So he snuggles up to the DC-9 in line ahead of Palm 90. The pilot hopes that the exhaust from the two engines at the back of the airplane ahead will melt the snow accumulating on the wings of his 737. Like using the reversed thrusters earlier at the gate, there's a regulation specifically prohibiting this. Again, the inexperienced crew made a bad and seemingly unbelievable decision when faced with a situation that they had not encountered before. And though warming the wings with the exhaust from the plane ahead might seem like a good idea, and the exhaust actually did indeed melt some of the snow on Palm 90's wings, the temperature was 24 degrees. The snow on the wings had been melted to a slushy mixture that quickly froze as the DC-9 turned away toward the runway for its own departure. And then what hadn't frozen already then froze quickly as Palm 90 accelerated down the runway. In the captain's defense, or at least to give an idea about what he may have been thinking, there had been a lot of delays. The airport had been closed and then reopened and then closed again. There are a lot of airplanes trying to take off, and the captain knows that the line to the runway will be long and slow. The de-icing procedure had been done a long time ago, and it's been snowing. They were already late, and there just wasn't time to go back to the gate and get de-iced again. Snuggling up to the airplane in front for a little bit of heat to melt the snow before takeoff must have seemed like a good idea at the time to the Air Florida pilot. By the way, the flight crew didn't know it, but the de-icing had been accomplished incorrectly. Not only was it done almost an hour ago, but the spray techs did it wrong. Maybe it won't come as a surprise to know that this small, value-based airline from Florida doesn't have its own de-icing equipment at all the airports it operates into. When any company is faced with this scenario, they either borrow or lease the equipment or the service, and that's what Air Florida did. They had an arrangement with American Airlines to de-ice Air Florida's planes. So it was American Airlines employees who sprayed down Palm 90. Part of this arrangement includes using plugs and covers over various parts of the airplane and engines during de-icing. This equipment was not used. The arrangement with American is to provide a 25% glycol de-icing solution, but the operator today used a spray nozzle with an improperly functioning mix monitor, so the operators actually had no way of knowing what was being sprayed on the aircraft. Post-crash investigation data showed that the two sides of Palm 90 were de-iced with different de-icing mixtures. And this is because two different spray technicians working the de-icing vehicle sprayed the airplane with two different percentage-based solutions. One tech later said he upped the solution from 25 to 30%. The other technician did not. Both sprayer techs were familiar with spraying American Airlines planes, like the Boeing 727, but American did not have the 737 in their fleet, so the technicians were unfamiliar with what was in the manual. In the end, what was selected by the operator didn't matter. The FBI ran laboratory tests on the sprayer nozzle and discovered that when the nozzle was set on 25%, the nozzle actually delivered 13%. We'll get more into the post-crash investigation findings later in this podcast, but this situation, in a larger, overarching way, was addressed by the NTSB after their investigation. What had been a somewhat laissez-faire industry attitude towards de-icing before the crash became regulated and regimented after the crash. In fact, if you've flown in the snow and ice since the Air Florida investigation was completed, you have a lot to be thankful for. And it all traces back to January 13th, 1982, and Palm 90. Another significant error that led up to the crash was an item on the pilot's checklist. A flight crew spends a lot of time going through checklists, and checklists are important so that small tasks are not overlooked or forgotten. And whether you have a checklist for your morning routine, like brush your teeth, grab your phone, lock the door, or whether you're on the flight deck of a commercial jetliner with multiple checklists for before start, before taxi, and before takeoff procedures, these checklists exist for a reason. And not only do checklists prevent the little things from being overlooked, but they remove ambiguity. Instead of, should we set the altimeter, we have set the altimeter. And waiting in line for 49 minutes before takeoff is a great time to go over checklists, maybe even for a second time. Yet a key item specific to the weather conditions at hand was disregarded.
Seats, check your battery level. Starting up the AP here shortly. Seatbelt sign on. Window heat on. Wing anti-ice, engine anti-ice. Go back off. Pumps, A and B system on and off.
Again, the crew had very little experience flying in these winter conditions, but when the first officer read off the engine anti-ice setting on the checklist, it doesn't seem possible that the captain responded with off. But he did, and he did not reach up to turn it on. Adding to the pressure in the cockpit was this. As the crew of Palm 90 received permission to take off, the tower notified them that another airplane was on final approach to the same runway and was just 2.5 miles out. The tower instructed the crew to not delay. Palm 90 then rolled on to runway 01, pushed the throttles forward, and began the takeoff roll. Power and speed came slowly. This was a problem directly related to the engine anti-ice setting, which caused higher than normal pressure readings. The first officer noted this to the captain, that the instrument readings weren't corresponding with the lower power and speed. Palm 90 went well past the normal spot where the plane would become airborne. Before reaching this critical phase of the flight, the captain could have aborted the takeoff. He did not. He noticed the snow and the ice in the wings. He acknowledged the loss of power reported by the first officer, and that the speed was building too slowly. He disagreed that the instruments were wrong. He continued the takeoff. It's easy to assume that the reason snow and ice on the wings is bad for the airplane is because of added weight. It's true, the less weight the better. However, what snow and ice really does is that its buildup on the wing changes the shape of the wing and will cause a loss of efficiency, and the wing will lose lift, the ability to hold up the airplane. The shape of a wing is very specific. Change it even slightly and it will provide less lift. Change it enough and the plane will literally fall out of the sky. And we're not talking about inches of snow on the wing, sometimes just a small amount of ice. What might even feel like only sandpaper to your fingers is enough to cause a loss of lift. Seeing something like that from the cockpit window can be almost impossible, but seeing snow and ice on the wing as the captain did should be of major concern to any pilot. Icing isn't confined to being a problem on the ground. It can also be a significant problem in the air. Pilots have to stay vigilant for icing when the conditions for icing are expected. Icing can occur in cloud and in precipitation, and the pilot must activate anti-icing and de-icing procedures, being proactive as needed and reactive when required. There are a lot of factors for the pilot and for the aviation meteorologist to consider. The temperature, the size and concentration of the droplets, the speed of the aircraft, even the shape of the wing will determine how much or, if any, icing will occur. There is even a point where the speed of the aircraft creates a process called aerodynamic heating, which is when the compression and friction of the droplet striking the wing creates a temperature rise sufficient to prevent icing. It was 30 seconds past 4 o'clock on January 13, 1982, when the captain called out V1, and then shortly after, V2. V1 is the speed at which an aborted takeoff is no longer possible. V2 is the minimum safe speed for takeoff. 8 seconds after that, the stall indicator alarms. 22 seconds after that, the cockpit voice recorder records the sound of the impact as Palm 90 struck the 14th Street Bridge. The Boeing 737 reached an altitude of just 352 feet, or about 107 meters, before it began to fall. When it struck the bridge, the plane hit 7 vehicles, killing 4 people. One of those people was First Lieutenant Michael Saunders, the husband of my supervisor at the Andrews Air Force Base Weather Station, where I was a young Air Force weather observer. Today, Andrews is known as Joint Base Andrews. It's about 10 miles from the crash site on the southeast side of Washington, D.C. In the water, Palm 90 quickly became submerged. The water depth in this location is about 25 to 30 feet, or about 9 meters. TV images show only the tail of the plane above water. The plane was about 150 feet offshore and not quite a mile away from the runway from which it had just departed. The water of the Potomac River was freezing. There were chunks of ice visible in the water. Perhaps no other city in the country has the large numbers of media personnel than does Washington, D.C. The White House and the Capitol building are very close to the crash site. Even though the snow hampered travel for cars and ambulances alike, the media was on site quickly, and televised coverage of the in-progress rescues was broadcast across the country. Ice in the water and snow on the banks of the river made rescue difficult. There was a Coast Guard rescue tug based nearby with a crew specially trained in ice breaking and water rescues, but they were quite a ways downriver at the time, working a different search and rescue operation. The river itself, with all the broken ice, made moving toward the plane impossible. People on the shore, however, were attempting to help in any way they could, and some were even entering the water and trying to swim toward the plane to assist survivors. 20 minutes after the crash, a Park Police helicopter arrived on site and began to airlift survivors from the water. With tremendous skill, the pilot and the flight medic worked so close to the surface of the water that, at times, the helicopter's skids disappeared under the icy water. The chopper used a rope to tow survivors to the shore. It was an agonizingly slow process. The helicopter returned to the tail section of the aircraft to tow more passengers back to shore. Arland Williams was near the tail of the aircraft, but could not unstrap himself from the wreckage. He passed the rescue line to another passenger. The helicopter returned again, and on the third trip back to the airplane, the paramedic, who was not tethered to the helicopter, dropped 2 lifelines. Again, Mr. Williams passed the lines to other passengers, as he was still unsuccessful in trying to extricate himself from the wreckage. At the beginning of this podcast, I mentioned that one of the spans of the 14th Street Bridge complex is named the Arland D. Williams Bridge. When the helicopter returned a 4th time to the wreckage, this time to rescue Mr. Williams, the 737 had shifted and Mr. Williams was now submerged. After continually passing the lifeline to other passengers, Mr. Williams had lost his life to the river. In an unfortunate twist of circumstance, the winter storm had caused many people in the D.C. area to leave work early. The Pentagon was nearby, and many military personnel had been released and were on the road home, and many were on the bridge. The roads were packed and traffic was slow. With Palm 90 in the water, this slowed the emergency response to the disaster as traffic near the crash site had now come to a complete stop. Unrelated to the plane crash, one of the D.C. Metro rail lines suffered a train derailment just 30 minutes after the plane crash and only about a mile and a half away. There were 3 fatalities associated with this train crash, and emergency crews were now split between the underground train derailment and the submerged airplane. This incident shut down the D.C. subway system. Incredibly, within a span of less than 40 minutes, the D.C. area had lost use of its busiest airport, its busiest highway, and its busiest subway, as well as one rapid transit line. A very large and very busy part of Washington, D.C. had come to a total standstill, and the incident response teams of D.C. were put to an unbelievable test. As with most disasters, there are heroes amidst the tragedy, and this was indeed true this day on the Potomac River. A government employee named Lenny Skutnik came to be recognized as the face of the rescue efforts. Like all the bystanders watching the scene, Mr. Skutnik watched helplessly from the shore. With the freezing temperatures, snow, and chunks of ice floating in the river, everyone understood it would likely be a suicide mission to enter the water. Yet there was a passenger being rescued by the helicopter who could no longer hold on to the tow rope that was dragging her and 2 other survivors to the shoreline. She fell back into the water. When the helicopter returned for her, she could still not grab or hang on to the tow line. To those on shore, it appeared her fate was sealed. One person would not accept what appeared obvious to everybody else. With the news cameras recording the rescue, Mr. Skutnik peeled off his jacket and boots, then dove into the water to swim out to her. He successfully pulled her to the shore. Other heroes included Roger Olean, who was the first bystander to enter the water to help survivors. Mr. Olean was driving home on the 14th Street Bridge at the time of the crash. For their bravery, both Mr. Skutnik and Mr. Olean received the Coast Guard's Gold Life-Saving Medal. Mr. Williams also received the award posthumously. For his amazing and almost surgically precise flying, Park Ranger Police Helicopter pilot Donald Usher was awarded the Coast Guard's Silver Life-Saving Medal. Also so awarded was flight paramedic Melvin Windsor. Additionally, both Park Police crewmen, as part of the Department of Interior, were awarded the department's Valor Award. The 4 men, Olean, Skutnik, Usher, and Windsor, also received the Carnegie Hero Fund Medal. Kelly Duncan, the only surviving member of the crew, was recognized in the NTSB accident report for her unselfish act of giving the only life vest she could find to a passenger. 2 weeks later, at President Ronald Reagan's State of the Union address, Mr. Skutnik was invited by the president to sit in the gallery during the address. The president recognized Mr. Skutnik's heroism as he received a standing ovation. The loss of life due to this crash included 70 of the 74 passengers, 4 motorists on the bridge, and 4 of the 5 crew members, including both pilots. Let's begin to wrap this up and talk about the post-crash investigation. The NTSB attributed the crash to pilot error. All the things mentioned previously in this podcast were cited. The pilots failed to switch on the engine anti-icing. The pilots used reverse thrust at the gate before takeoff. The pilots used the jet exhaust from the aircraft in front of them to melt the snow and ice on their wings. The pilots failed to abort the takeoff, even after noticing the buildup of snow and ice on the wings and after detecting the power problem. This crash brought about significant changes to the way aircraft are de-iced. No longer are they de-iced only at the gate, but they may be de-iced after pushback and before taxi. There are also now de-icing stations much closer to the runway, so a final de-icing can occur just before takeoff. In addition to the de-icing procedures, there are other improvements. Today, better snow removal equipment clears the runway faster and allows planes to get to the runway more quickly, reducing not only overall airport delays, but also reducing the time between de-icing and takeoff. Pilot training and flight procedures have also been improved, and more attention is paid to minimizing the time between de-icing and takeoff. Despite these significant changes, icing situations unfortunately still cause tragic accidents and loss of life, although the overall numbers of these types of accidents is down dramatically since rule changes have been enacted following the crash of Air Florida Flight 90. One last thing, the demise of Air Florida, the airline. Air Florida shuttered its offices and grounded its fleet 2.5 years after the 14th Street Bridge crash. The airline, once consisting of nearly 60 airplanes and service to 99 cities, faced what other airlines faced in the 1980s: fare wars, the recession, and a decline in travel. Many have said that the airline was already in financial trouble before the crash and would have closed soon anyway. Others have said that the crash of Air Florida Flight 90 was the beginning of the end for the airline. Still, one airline expert said, and I quote, "I don't believe one crash can make or break an airline." I think all of that is true, but I'll leave it to you to make your own decisions. That's all for this time on Radar Contact Lost, the podcast. Thanks for listening. With each new episode, I will bring you interesting but tragic stories of plane crashes from around the United States and the world. When these crashes involve the weather as a possible cause or contributing factor, I'll rely on my 40-year career as an Air Force, broadcast, and commercial meteorologist with a specialty of aviation meteorology to explain what happened and why. If you like this episode, give a like and leave a review, and tell your friends. On Instagram, follow @RadarContactLost Podcast. I'm Dave Gorham.